Hey everyone, welcome to Histories of Horror, the October kickoff event. Before we dive into today's episode, I want to take a moment to honor someone whose strength and spirit are woven into every episode we produce, which is my co host, AL. She's not only a voice on the show, but she's also a warrior navigating caregiving for a husband on dialysis and many of her own healthcare conditions. She's got a lot of systemic battles within that, but she handles them all with grace and grit, which is kind of the story of our lives here. If you've ever been felt moved by her insight, her humor, or her presence on Histories of Horror, now is the time to show up and support her. AL has a GoFundMe that is live right now, and every contribution will be helping to ease the weight that she carries daily while preparing for a big move because they are anticipating that her husband will probably pass away. Because of this, they would like to relocate back to Tennessee, and they live in Iowa right now. They have a lot of family in Tennessee. That's where they were originally married and everything, and they have been married for over 20 years. So this is obviously a very big hurdle for her to face, and she needs as much support right now as possible. So if you can, and you're able, share the GoFundMe, contribute, and let's see how we can help support her with that move. And remember that here on Histories of Horror, we're not just telling stories, we're building a legacy. And obviously, AL is a huge part of mine. That said, some good news. Um, you'll find her GoFundMe link in the show notes. And switching over to the good news, while we're speaking of legacy, I want to thank every single one of you who has showed up for me and voted, shared, and supported me in the Face of Halloween contest. I actually made quarter-finalist, and I could not have done that without you and the many, many donations you made to Starlight Children's Foundation on my behalf. You guys did it. All because of you, I'm in the quarterfinals, but we're definitely not done yet. And this isn't just a contest. I want to remind everyone it's a campaign for visibility, for artistry, and for impact for sick children, which is the biggest part to me. Every donor vote you cast on my behalf supports Starlight Children's Foundation, and as you know, I'm the mother of two sons that are wheelchair bound with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. So I know exactly what it's like to watch your children with a terminal illness and how very heartbreaking it is to be able to do nothing about it, yet still have to be resilient and strong because you have to be that rock for those kids. It is one of the most challenging crosses that any person will ever have to bear, and I know exactly what it's like. So that's part of the reason why I decided to do the Face of Halloween. So again, starting tomorrow on Monday is when the quarterfinalist voting begins. They're going to have free daily votes for me. Please put those in every single day. Do not miss one single day. Or go in and put in some donations on my behalf for Starlight Children's Foundation, knowing that that money is going to bring joy to these very terminally ill children, which is a staple point to healing. Without any kind of happiness or joy or motivation and ambition for living life, you pretty much have a person give up. And the worst thing to do is to see that happen to a child. So vote daily if you can, donate to Starlight on my behalf, and let's make this a season of shadows that shines for those who need it most. The link to voting for me is also in the show notes. And again, like I said, the round begins first thing Monday, October the 6th. So let's conjure something unforgettable together. That said, welcome to the show. AL and I are beyond excited about our special guest today. He's the author of One Hand Screaming 20 Haunting Years, as well as his latest relaunched book, Haunted Hamilton. Please give a warm welcome to Mark Leslie on Histories of Horror.
It is an honor to be here. Thanks so much for having me on the show.
Okay, Mark, can you tell us about One Hand Screaming and what inspired you to put that collection together?
Well, initially, so 21 years ago, I had a bunch of short stories that were published in small press horror magazines because the going wisdom at the time for writers was build up your reputation by selling short stories to various smaller markets, and then you can get an agent or an editor from a publishing house interested in your book. Well, I'd had dozens of stories published over the years and was working in the book industry, and people would come into the store and find out I was a writer, and they would look around the bookstore and say, well, where can I find your writing? And I would say, well, it's in this magazine and it's only available for a limited time, circulation 500, maybe 1,000 copies. And then it was gone. And so in 2004, I put together a collection of those previously published horror stories, and I published it myself, and I called it One Hand Screaming. And it was maybe 190 pages. It was relatively thin, but it was just my attempt to want to get a book out into the world. And so I have since published more than 40 books, but on the 20th anniversary of the release of that book, I wanted to do something special because it was the thing that got me to that next phase. I mean, I think my first traditionally published book came out 2 years after that. And then I started working with publishers and doing my own. So I've got a variety of books. So I thought, hey, it's been 20 years. I've still sold short fiction horror stories to other markets. And I thought, okay, let's do a more than twice size 20th anniversary, sort of a second edition of the book. We'll add more stories. We'll make it twice the size. We get some original artwork that I commissioned for it, and I launched it. So it's over just a little over 400 pages. And I thought, okay, well, I don't just want to call it One Hand Screaming the second edition. I thought, let's call it 20 Haunting Years. Although technically, when you look at it, there's really 40 haunting years, because I had actually started writing and got my very first rejection at the age of 15. So when this book came out, it was technically 40 years of being a writer.
Oh, that's a big milestone. Congratulations on that.
Thank you. It's pretty
Very
exciting.
big milestone. How'd it feel revisiting One Hand Screaming now, 20 years later?
So it was really interesting because I remember selecting the first go through, selecting, okay, I've got a whole bunch of published stories, but I want to use these particular ones. I'm not going to use these other ones. And even just some poetry and a couple pieces that had not been published elsewhere, but I thought would fit well in the book. And it was so fascinating to go back to that, particularly because I've edited more than half a dozen anthologies, science fiction, fantasy, and horror anthologies. So I've gotten a lot more experience at selecting stories and then placing them. Where do they go in the book? Because the overall book has to have a certain feel. You don't want to have too many really dark things right back to back. You don't want to, you want to balance it out and say, okay, this one's a little bit lighter, it's more humorous, or this one's touching, this one's scary. And so I applied all of those things I had learned in editing anthologies. So when I reapproached the book, I thought it was really important to pay homage to the original. So I got my cover designer. I showed him the original cover and said, okay, I need it to get a little bit scarier. So the original cover it was a picture close up of my eye. There was a sketch of a skull superimposed into my eye, like reflective in my eye. And then there's sort of a hand popping out from the text, One Hand Screaming. And I said, can you make it a little darker, a little punchier? So I took a recent photo of my eye, so 20 years later, that older eye, a little bit more wrinkles around my eye as well. Sent that off to him and said, hey, let's see what you can do. So not only did he do the skull, but he decided to add some blood splatter onto my eye as well and make it even darker than before. And then as I was putting the stories together, I wanted to pay tribute. So I kind of show the reader what was in the original table of contents and indicate, okay, this story is new to this edition, or this story has never been published before as well. So I wanted to have all of those little nuggets in there. And honestly, it was kind of like going into the kitchen with a whole bunch of great ingredients, recognizing you're not going to be able to use all the ingredients that are there, because there were several stories that I really wanted to put in here, and I had to leave them on the cutting room floor because the book would have been way more than twice the size. It would have been a lot bigger. So I had to cut a lot of stories that I would have wanted to put in there, and then go to the best of the best and just know, well, okay, maybe that's something I do on the next big anniversary.
So, what changed in your writing since then?
It's interesting to see how, I mean, I've constantly been growing as a writer, and it's interesting to see how some of the themes that I explored later on were somewhat complementary to the themes I explored when I was a younger person, but also um, I learned more as a writer. I could attack them with a bit more experience, and it was so funny because one of the stories that appeared in the original edition, as I was kind of going through it again, and really tempted not to make too many revisions because I wanted it to be true to the original, because it had already been edited by an editor when it was published in a magazine. But looking at it and seeing a story, so there's a story I remember, the first draft I wrote when I was about 15 years old, and it was inspired by I was doing my homework or whatever, And my mom started running around and closing the blinds and and panicking, like, oh my God, we got to be careful. They're here. They're here. And I was like, oh my God, what's going on? And I just found out it was just, this door to door religion that was coming to, proselytize at the house. And my imagination as a person who writes scary stories was, I thought, oh, it's like vampires or something. They're coming and they can't see that you're in the house, that sort of thing. And so I wrote this story. And in the story, I imagined a middle-aged man who wrote true ghost stories and paranormal tales, and that his wife it's set in the future where science has moved so far that all religion is seen as supernatural and scary and spooky and stuff like that. So there's a lot of mistrust there. And he's playing upon his wife's fear because that's how he makes his living, is when people are afraid of things. And so what was really interesting is coming back to this story, looking at it and saying, oh my God, little did I know when I wrote the first draft of that story at the age of 15 that I would become a middle-aged man who makes a decent living off of sharing true ghost stories. I mean, I've only published half a dozen true ghost story books, but that was an interesting revelation to come to. Seeing myself in some of those stories I'd written when I was younger.
Your latest book is Haunted Hamilton. What drew you to write about the haunted history?
So it's so fascinating. I was always in high school. I remember history was the class I did the poorest in. I could never keep dates straight, names and dates, and memorizing when this proclamation happened and this law came into effect or whatever. But my very first visit to the capital city in Canada, Ottawa, I remember going on a ghost walk, a historic ghost walk. And that's where the light bulb moment for me happened, is for the very first time, as I was on this walk, and there's a person in a black cloak with a lantern, and they're all dressed in, acting the role and taking us on a walk through downtown Ottawa and telling us about some ghost stories, but also sharing some historic elements related to Canada. And I learned the history that I should have learned in high school because it was made fun and entertaining and interesting in a different way. And so when I moved to Hamilton, Ontario, that one of the first things I did to get to know the city was I went on the ghost walks. I went on as many of the different, because they had 4 or 5 different ghost walks for different neighborhoods and areas. And I went on them all so I could embrace the city and learn to love the city. And that's what inspired me to look at I work in the book industry as well, and I was working as a bookseller at the time. And I looked at the industry and said, well, there's a market for ghost walks and the interest in the macabre and ghosts in Hamilton, but there's no books about this. And so that led to pitching the book Haunted Hamilton to Dundurn, Canada's largest independent publisher. And lo and behold, they said that they would love to publish the book. And so I got that acceptance almost immediately from sending out the proposal. And then I was tasked with, okay, now I have to write this book.
Wow, that's pretty cool. Did you discover anything during your research for Haunted Hamilton that genuinely surprised you?
Yeah, there were a few interesting tidbits about Hamilton itself that I learned. I mean, in general, I was surprised, and I've often described the book Haunted Hamilton as my love letter to the city, because as I was researching it, I fell in love with the city. And at one point in time during the research of the book, my wife and my son and I were taking a walk through our neighborhood. And in the neighborhood that we lived in on Hamilton Mountain, that's the Niagara Escarpment, but the locals call it the mountain. The Our entire neighborhood was, I learned, the backyard of the Akhmar estate, which was a giant mansion that was still being used for various, it's a historic location, but it was being used for various tours and even movie shoots and things like that because of the beautiful, the beautiful look and feel of this stately place. But as we were walking through the neighborhood, there's those, the historic plaques that they sometimes have in different landmarks. And there's this building that was like on the edge of the escarpment. And we'd walked by it probably hundreds of times over the years. And as we were walking by it, I actually stopped and looked at it, and I read the plaque, and I was like, oh my God, this was the gatehouse for their mansion, which is 6 blocks the other way. And as I was reading the plaque, I just saw my own neighborhood in a way that I had never seen it before because of this research. And I think that's some of the beauty that can happen when you're doing a nonfiction book and you're looking into, yes, I was looking into ghosts, and I was looking into, I wanted the scary stories to and the atmospheric elements. But whenever you're telling those stories, you can't help but have to, dig into the history and look at the people and the places and the things that have come before us. And so that teaches you, I guess, respect and wanting to honor the legacy of the generations that have come before us and the people who were on this land before us. So that was unexpected. I expected to be chilled, but I did not expect to fall in love with the city and to be so enthusiastic about the history of it as well.
That's pretty beautiful, honestly.
I agree. Do you personally believe in ghosts or the paranormal?
I do. I am one of the biggest chickens you will ever meet. I am afraid of the dark still at the age of 56. I'm afraid of the monster under my bed, the boogeyman, all those things. When my son was little, it was really difficult when, if he would ever, I was worried he would come into the room and say, Dad, I see the boogeyman. And I couldn't tell him he wasn't real because I believed that the boogeyman was real. So that was a challenge. But I think, yeah, I am convinced that there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophies, as Hamlet said to his dear friend Horatio in that Shakespeare play. But I I'm fascinated by the various theories of what a ghost actually is. And I love the fact that, you know, some theories are that ghosts are the spirits of the departed who may be trapped on this mortal plane and they haven't properly escaped and properly shucked off all of this mortal coil, as Shakespeare and Hamlet would say again. And then there's other theories about what a ghost might be in terms of an impression, more like a scientific impression, like an old cathode ray tube television, where an image is impressed onto the screen so powerfully that it stays there as a sort of ghostly image even after that image is no longer being broadcast. So yeah, I am definitely a believer.
Yeah, we had an episode we talked about that a little bit because she's been to Waverly and I've been to Lalaurie, so we were talking about paranormal tracing, and it's interesting that you brought that up. That's kind of a side note. How do you approach balancing folklore, legend, and documented history in your storytelling?
It's that's a great question, because that is something that I think I've had to balance. I know when I was working on Haunted Hamilton, there is one story in the book of a place that was nicknamed Murder Mansion. And as the legend goes, and it's a beautiful old building that actually is no longer there because it's been torn down. But as the legend goes, this beautiful mansion that was on the escarpment of the Hamilton Mountain, looking down on the lower part of the city, there was a family there. And one night, the man kind of lost his mind, maybe was consumed by something. He grabbed the axe out of the shed. He murdered his son and his wife, and then he went and hung himself on the widow's walk. And as the legend goes, the next family that moved into the house, the teenage son, found that same axe in the shed, murdered his father, and murdered his mother, and then hung himself on the widow's walk. So those were the legends I'd heard about the story. And my wife had grown up in Hamilton, and she had heard similar legends about that house. And she was among the generation that would, when they got to that house, walking through the neighborhood, they would cross the street even in the daylight, because nobody wanted to go near that house. And there were stories about what people would see in the windows, and they would see this woman. It looked like her hair was on fire, flaming red, as she was running, screaming past the windows on the second floor, as someone seemed to be chasing her. So all these stories were put together. And so as a researcher, I wanted to look into, okay, so the building of the house and the architecture is always very important because people are always interested in that. And that's what makes it a historic landmark. And then looking into the alleged murders, well, when I dug into the history of it, I found out that there were no murders in that time frame, with definitely with axes in that neighborhood for like a 60-80 year period. And again, the logistics of, had there actually been an axe murder that took place, there's no way that same axe would be in the house. It would be in an evidence locker somewhere from the first murder. But anyways, when I was writing that chapter, I felt it was my job as the person who was documenting this to say, hey, here are the stories that are told about this house, but here's the detailed research I did to find that I couldn't find any evidence that any of this was anything but made up stories. And I remember my editor coming back and saying, well, you don't want to do that. People are reading the book because they want the spooky stuff, and you're removing the suspension of disbelief. And I came back and I said, but if I ignore the evidence and don't share that evidence, I'm doing the reader a disservice, because I'm lying to them and I want to tell them the truth. So my editor convinced me to tone down the research element and just to express in a single paragraph, rather than documenting it for 2 or 3 pages, that I wasn't able to find any proof, which made more sense because the documentation and the research I did was not as interesting as the story itself. And so I did adjust the chapter to say, and even to note that the stories came out around the time that The Shining, with Stanley Kubrick film starring Jack Nicholson, they came out around that time, with the scenes where he's chasing his family with the axe. And I often find that some stories and some legends and some folklore come from popular culture at the time, right? We're influenced by the things that we see, hear, and feel. And so I did change that chapter, and I did express that while I can't find any evidence that any of these stories are actually happened, still it's a pretty neat story, isn't it? That kind of thing. So I wanted to be true to being honest with the reader, saying, I don't think this is real, but I didn't want to remove the suspension of disbelief too harshly.
Okay, so I actually went to Astoria, Oregon here recently because I'm writing a haunted mansion story. And the family was the Flavel Mansion, and I can confirm that this urban legend does have basis off Hatchet Harry in Astoria, Oregon, which is a documented account of, he was one of George Flavel was one of the main people that founded Astoria and the gateway of the Pacific and everything up there. He was a tugboat captain that helped people navigate through the channel to get in and out. Anyways, side note, but it's interesting because I was like, I agree with you on all of those things in the Stanley Kubrick, and I think it's really interesting that there's not a lot known about Hatchet Harry except for to the people from Oregon.
Right.
And yeah, it actually is accounted for, and there is newspaper documentation. So that's something you might be interested in collaborating and, looking up there. But yeah, that's a very popular urban legend that
Yeah.
actually I have found a historical documented fact, and I believe it happened in the 60s.
That's amazing when you can actually find the story that led to the legend, right?
Yes, and actually, I will link that. I will give you a link to that, and I will link it in the show notes too, just so people can go look it up because it's such an interesting undersung story that is such a giant worldwide urban legend now that I feel like it'd be nice for people to know more about it.
Yeah, and thank you. I can't wait to check it out.
So excited to click that link too now. So, Mark, of all the haunted locations in Hamilton, which story stuck with you the most?
I think there's one that I call the Tombstone Ghost, and it was one that was based on a series of newspaper articles from the Hamilton Spectator, and I actually got a hold of them because, thank goodness, I love librarians so much, and the archivists and the local history librarians are my favorite people, because, or the research librarians as well, because you can go to them and say, hey, I'm looking for this. Do you have anything on this? And they love a challenge. I saw the librarian's eyes light up. And Margaret was her name. I'll never forget her. Margaret Bryant was the local historian library. And she said, you just sit yourself down right there and I will bring you some stuff. And she brought me all of these file folders that they had of newspaper clippings and all kinds of hauntings from the area. But anyways, this was one of them. And so, in a nutshell, there was a gentleman who had, as the story starts off, he wakes up in the middle of the night because he hears screaming. he looks over and his wife is laying on her back, staring up the ceiling, screaming. And he says, "What's wrong?" And she said, "Oh my God, there was this hag looking woman floating just a few feet above my head. That her eyes were deep sunken eye sockets, but I knew she was staring right at me. And her lips were moving, but I couldn't hear what she was trying to say something to me. And I freaked out and I started screaming. And then she kind of flew off to the corner of the bedroom and disappeared into the wall." And he's like, "Whoa, hang on." And so he didn't believe her. But then a few nights later, the same thing happened, but it happened to him, and he saw the exact same woman with the sunken eyes and the lips moving, but he couldn't hear what she was saying, and he yelled out in fright. And the minute he yelled out, she disappeared off into that corner of the bedroom wall. Well, it freaked them out so much they ended up getting a medium and an exorcist to come in and investigate this house to see what was going on. And they did find that there was that the medium had determined that there was a female spirit that was seeking something, and it had something to do with something that was in the wall. But this was an apartment they were renting in a building, and there's no way they're going to start tearing the wall apart. So they ended up moving. And then you flash back to 10 years later. There's a picture in this Hamilton Spectator of the guy from the story, and he's holding, his name was Norm, he's holding the newspaper article from 10 years earlier that has the sketch of the haggard woman. And they found that they were tearing the building down to put up another building on that spot, and they found a tombstone in the wall, which was the wall of their bedroom, which is where she was disappearing. And when they looked into, based on the tombstone, it was the tombstone of two of the children of this woman who had died. And I guess when they had built that building, the tombstone somehow got brought into that part of the wall and the foundation, and it was just part of it. And it's like she was trying to alert them to the fact that her kids weren't properly at rest. And it was so fascinating. This one caught my imagination, because it was a story that that starts up again 10 years later, and then they finally solved what it was that was happening. So that was some one that stuck with me, and it was one that terrifies me, because sometimes when I'm lying awake at night and I open my eyes, I just am worried that I might see something hovering about 3 feet above the bed, just like in that tale.
I think we can all relate to that sometimes with writing stories like this. What connections do you see between your early horror fiction and your nonfiction exploration of haunted places?
I think what's really fascinating is when I do the research or I learn about a place, I'm not sure where I'm going to go with this story. So sometimes if I have a particular theme that I'm working on, for example, I am working on a book of ghost stories about the Great Lakes. I'll know, okay, I'm putting this in a folder. I'm going to research it as part of this project. But other times I will just make a note of this haunting or this location or this whatever research. And sometimes that becomes the inspiration for a story. So for example, I remember years ago as a bookseller, I was chatting with fellow booksellers, and somebody had shared this story. It was about this Victorian cabinet, and it was from a museum. And the security guards at the museum were always afraid to walk by this one particular cabinet in the museum, because if they looked at the right angle, they sometimes caught the reflection of this Victorian girl who they nicknamed Vicky, who was constantly fixing her hair, like she's not satisfied and she's trying to adjust the bow in her hair. And then the minute she catch their eye in the mirror, she would disappear. And that was a story. Now, I could never find where it came from, if it was just a legend or what the details were, but the story stuck with me. And that became a story that I ended up using in the collection One Hand Screaming, where I took that story as an idea of a haunted object, right? So the mirror itself is haunted by this young Victorian girl. And I imagined a collector of haunted artifacts. And I asked the question, what would happen if a collector of haunted artifacts put a whole bunch of different artifacts into a single room as a collector? Would the ghosts get along? Right? You think about when teenagers having to share the same bedroom suddenly or whatever, and it was meant to be darkly humorous in some ways. And so that's a case where I heard this story. I didn't find out if it was true or not, but I took the story and I adapted it into fiction. And that's what I sometimes do, because at least, particularly with a tale that won't leave my mind, at least I get to exercise those demons. At least I get to play with it and say, okay, now I can do something with this rather than just let it fly off into the ether.
I actually really like that idea. Um, Having all of the haunted objects in one area, you would have to think like what kind of chaos that would create. It's a
Yeah.
really good idea.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, again, I don't know if the ghosts would necessarily get along if
Yeah,
you
it's like
force
you
them to live
said, it'd be
together.
like a bunch of teenagers thrown into one bedroom to share.
Yeah,
All I can
exactly.
see
Stop
is
touching me.
13. All I can see is 13 ghosts.
Yeah. How do you hope readers respond to your books, both the horror fiction and the haunted history work?
I think the thing that I want as a writer is I want to either take someone away into an imagined place and time and story and people, and just to enjoy the experience as if it's a real story that they can just fall into and maybe forget about things for a while in their own lives, which is sometimes what good fiction can be. It can be a great place that we can kind of escape into because in the stories there are things that happen in our lives that we can't control, but at least in the fiction, sometimes I can control that the good guys win when I do the true stories as well. I think the other thing I really want is I want to ensure that the reader feels something, whether it's fear, whether it makes them wonder about something, it probes some questions. Maybe it reminds them of some experience they've had or someone they know. It allows them to maybe potentially walk in another person's shoes, which helps build empathy. Or maybe it just allows them to laugh. I think that's the goal. I really want people, when they read something of mine, is to actually feel something. And so if they feel something, and hopefully they don't feel frustrated and angry that they wasted their time reading my story, I'm hoping that they actually felt, good, or they laughed, or they felt fear, or they felt curious, and that sense of wonder in them was perked. Any of those things are, to me, a sign that I have been successful in as a storyteller.
I can agree with that. I always say I write to inspire, educate, and entertain.
Yeah, yeah,
If I'm doing any of those, I'm doing my job.
exactly.
Do you find writing horror fiction scarier, or is uncovering true ghost stories more unsettling?
You know, I think the true ghost stories are more unsettling because you're talking about things that have happened to and influenced people. And you're talking about tragic events and often sad events. So I think those are more disturbing, at least in horror fiction. There's two good things about horror fiction is if it's really disturbing and too scary, you can close the book and put it aside and the boogeyman's gone. Or me as the writer, I can control that good can win out over evil. I can control that. I can't control that in the world, but at least I can control it in my stories. And so I think, yeah, I think that the I'm more disturbed or frightened by the real life stuff because that's stuff we can't really control in any way. And I'm just sharing sort of a documentation of what has occurred, what witnessed have experienced, or what's been, relayed about a particular place or time.
Looking back at your career, what do you think has stayed consistent in your storytelling voice?
One of the things that I think has been consistent has been my sense of wonder. Now, because I was attracted to this genre because I'm scared of everything. And perhaps a lot of my writing has been therapy for myself to deal with the monsters and the ghouls and the goblins and the shadows that keep creeping out. But I do think that the one thing, whether it's horror fiction that I write, urban fantasy, whether it's true ghost stories, whether it's even some of the nonfiction I write about, 80s movie trivia and stuff like that, is I think that sense of wonder. I approach the topic with my own passion and curiosities. And I think that drives me to want to pull as much of that story out as I can to relay to the reader so that they can have that same feeling in some way, shape, or form.
What advice would you give to writers who want to explore the horror or paranormal genre?
The first bit of advice I would offer is to say, start with something that you're genuinely either afraid of or have anxiety about, because at that point, you're dealing with something that you can understand why someone would be afraid of that thing. Because fiction, horror fiction, is really about people, and horror is an emotion, not a genre. And true ghost stories are about people. They're about the people who experience the paranormal, but they're also about the people who we believe are the spirits as well. And I think that's a good place to start. Looking at the fears, but also not forgetting the importance of the humanity in it. Your own humanity as a mortal who fears and has things, but also the humanity of the people in each of the stories. And I think that's an important thing that you need to focus on when you're writing those.
Can you tell us what you're working on next?
Well, I do have a book that's due with the publisher in December. It's called Ghost Stories of the Great Lakes. And I am in the throes of research for that right now. And I will be writing it in the next, well, I have to turn it in December. So I've got about 6 weeks to get that written and turned in. And that one comes out in probably in the summer or fall of 2026.
Sounds like you're going to be grindhousing soon.
I'm going to be doing a lot.
Well, Mark, this has really been incredible. Thank you for sharing your journey and your work with us. To everyone listening, make sure you check out One Hound Screaming, 20 Haunting Years, and Haunted Hamilton. I'm sure you're not going to want to miss these.
Thank you so much. It was great to chat with you both.
Thank you for coming to talk with us.